So, IDW Sonic issue number 84 is coming out, and it's going to feature the very first appearance of Sage in the comics. And everyone was working themselves all up into a tizzy over this. Everyone is saying, oh, Sage appearing in the comics proves the comics are canon. Because everything proves that the comics are canon in the eyes of the people who pretend to like this comic. I don't know why Sage's appearance proves that it's canon more so than any other character from the video games. I would think that Sonic appearing in the comics would take precedence over Sage in terms of proof of canonicity, but whatever, okay. At some point, it starts to feel like maybe these comic fans are trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. But aside from that, Sage appearing in issue 84 has, to these people, finally solidified the timeline of how the comics relate to the video games. See, the idea is that because Sage wasn't in all of the comics leading up to this point, that must mean that Sonic Frontiers hasn't happened yet. But now that Sage is making an appearance, that means that issue 84 can only possibly take place after Sonic Frontiers. So the picture of the Sonic timeline in their minds has become Sonic Forces happened, then all of the comics up through issue 83, then Sonic Frontiers happened, then issue 84. Case closed, right? And also, I guess, at some points, Team Sonic Racing happened in there, but I'm pretty sure that the people who like this stupid comic forgot that that game even existed. But then, Evan Stanley makes a blog post on Tumblr. These people, these two just never learn, do they? They never learn. Okay, so Evan Stanley made this blog post on Tumblr where she says, Frontiers does not take place after issue 83. Issue 84 is Sage's first appearance in the comics, which is different. Because of how Frontiers handles the Emeralds, it can only take place sometime shortly before issue 68. So the timeline that people had crafted in their mind's eye about how the comics relate to Sonic Frontiers in terms of the timeline's continuity has been thrown for a loop. Word of God has decanonized the timeline that everyone convinced themselves of when the solicitation for issue 84 came out showing that Sage was going to be in it. Oh my god. Somehow this is all Sega's fault, surely. Somehow Sega is the one making this comic timeline confusing, surely. You never learn. You people who like this stupid comic never learn, do you? You know, first of all, I don't know why everyone got themselves all worked up thinking that Frontiers takes place after issue 83 specifically anyway. Did Ian Flynn say something that made them think that, or was this something they just invented in their own imagination based on nothing and started spreading around as irrefutable fact? I understand the logic is Sage is in the comic now, so the comic has to be after Frontiers now, but Sonic Dream Team takes place after Frontiers too, and Sage isn't in that game, so I don't understand why they're treating Sage's presence as indicative of anything. The absence of Sage doesn't prove that a story takes place before Frontiers. Although it is incredibly amusing to me seeing Stanley do her typical thing of basically blaming everything on Sega and biting the hand that feeds. It's especially amusing to me now that she's, you know, an employee. I feel like if I spoke this way about my employer on my very public and broadly recognized social media page that has my name on it, my supervisor would pull me into a coaching session and explain to me how speaking negatively about the company is not going to be tolerated from someone who represents the company as an employee. But whatever, not my circus, not my monkeys. This explanation is asinine anyway. Sage recalled the Chaos Emeralds to the Starfall Islands the very night that Eggman attached her to the cyberspace tower. Sonic, Tails, and Amy all showed up at what is implied to be the very next morning. The time in between the emeralds being summoned to the islands and Sonic arriving at the islands is maybe a few hours. So Frontiers can take place at literally any point where all 7 emeralds aren't immediately accounted for, and when Sonic, Tails, Amy, and Knuckles aren't indisposed. Now, if the comic makes a point in time where that is the case hard to pin down, then that is a fault with the way the comic is written. That is your fault. That is the fault with the way the comic refuses to allow time to breathe in between storylines and constantly forces a strict ongoing narrative from issue to issue. This is why Daniel Barnes told you to stop doing that and to just make episodic stories for the comic. You know, kind of like how the games are written. The games are written as episodic narratives that do not require keeping up with the previous 83 games that came out beforehand. And I don't know why you refuse to do that. Why don't you write the comics in a way that resembles the way the games are written? Is it because you hate the games? Is it because you're writing these games as a spiteful anti-declaration against the video games? You know, one might almost think that that is the case based on the way you talk about this comic on your stupid Tumblr and Twitter and podcast. The way that she's talking about this really just cements how I was always correct in my declaration of how these two view the comics in relation to the games. They see the games as secondary to the comics. They view the comics as the primary medium for Sonic, and they expect the games to bow to the continuity they're crafting for the comics. And when the powers that be obviously do not conform to that, and instead treat the video games as the primary medium, and demand that the comics accommodate the games, they're gobsmacked. We knew this would be confusing and frustrating for longtime fans and pushed back, but it didn't work. They're so deluded that when reality does not match their expectations, they don't know how to handle it. You know, this is exactly what I said would happen in regards to them insisting the comics are canon, by the way. Because he knew that if the comic was canon, then that means it would always come second to the games. Their stories would have to bend to fit in with the games, not the other way around. The fact that people are acting like if the comics are canon, then the games would need to appease the comics is utter deluded insanity. The comics being canon doesn't magically mean that they have to include characters or storylines from the comics into the video games. In fact, quite the opposite. The comics would be forced to derail themselves in order to include things from the video games. Archie was never canon, and yet that happened to Archie all the damn time. They had to derail entire storylines in order to include a story that ties into a new Sega release. That's probably what Ian Flynn is remembering when he considers the question of whether or not the comics are canon. Too Long Did Not Read version, they're not canon, and you shouldn't want them to be. I said that 2 years ago. Golly, you know, it's almost like the comics just aren't canon or something. It's almost like the most natural explanation is simply that the comics aren't canon to the games, and they simply borrow continuity from the games. You know, IDW Sonic really is just Archie 2.0, and I don't know why they're still trying to pretend otherwise by trying to explain when comic issues take place relative to the events of the games. The comic is its own separate thing, and it just pulls on the games for reference material. That's what Archie did. The comic took place in its own continuity with Mobius and Overlanders and the Acorn Royal Family and all that junk that isn't in the games and is incompatible with the games. But then the events of Shadow the Hedgehog 2005 happened, and the comic directs readers to play that game as the basis for the new storyline. That's clearly just the same thing that the IDW's comic is doing. Now that issue 84 is coming out, there's a little narration box saying, oh, Sage's first appearance was in the Sonic Frontiers, the video game. Go play that to understand who this character is. And that's clearly how Sega wants it to be handled too. I don't get what the hang-up here is, aside from them just hating and resenting the entire franchise and the people who make it. That is also the most simple explanation. This comic is made by people who hate Sonic, for people who hate Sonic. At this point, that is truly undeniable. This is only a problem because you're making it a problem. Just accept that the comics aren't canon, as they always weren't. Cry about it, Merry Christmas.